There we go. All right. So today we're going to be talking about socialism and oppression. We're going to start with a bit of the origins of socialism, which I seem to have misspelled with a double L there. um, Starting with basic conditions, how they develop, what sort of features they have, the American Revolution and how it affected the Western Hemisphere, and then the sorts of oppression that is caused because of that revolution. So, starting with the origins, socialism is a collective response. It arises from self serving societies where success is highly individualized. Places like monarchies, very restrictive oligarchies. In the Western Hemisphere, it is usually the result of settler colonialism. This started even before Marx. 200 years before Marx, you had the levelers and the true levelers, which were also known as the diggers. This was a response to the overthrow of the English monarchy. As a matter of fact, the original levelers started as a military mutiny that they abolished all of the ranks in their unit, and they just kind of showed up with the rest of the units while they were supposed to be taking a vote on how they were going to go about things going forward. And they were like, we just kind of want anarchy. We want a land reform. We just want to start over from scratch, and we don't want the monarchy or the aristocracy. And the way that it wound up working out is that each of the units got a vote because they wanted to move away from a pure monarchy and wanted to start having some sort of democratic reins on it. So they were like, all right, let's practice this and we'll give everyone a vote. But they were also incredibly worried because two of their units out of, I believe it was like 8, wound up getting taken over by these anarchists. And they were like, well, if we give them an actual vote, they might vote against us. But in the end, they wound up only having their 2 units as a vote, and the English proceeded on with English history unabated. But the goal was land reform, and it stuck around. And then you had another group that came around called the True Levelers, because they didn't want to be associated with the anarchists. They wanted to be seen as more reasonable. And they were called the Diggers because they really, really tried hard to farm communal land, and it really didn't work out for them. So, features and development. I like to use Russia as a good base because most people understand the Russian context of socialism. But socialism really develops or a socialist state develops depending on the culture that it starts in and the history of that place. So in Russia, it started as a collective response to feudalism, and it was mostly among the aristocracy. Had origins in democratic and land reforms, including freeing of the serfs. All of these things they knew they needed to do as in the monarchy, but they were always a step behind. They couldn't ever quite convince themselves that what they needed to do was enough quickly enough. And by the time they actually got around to things, people had already taken another step forward and just sort of seen them as dragging behind everybody else. The reason that socialism was able to take hold in the Russian state was because it was weakened by war and imperialism that left it stretched way too thin to defend itself from internal domestic threats. So at one point, they transitioned from feudalism into capitalism. It was started by the government itself, the monarchy. They realized that they were behind other developed monarchies that had gone more in the direction of constitutional monarchies because they had a very agrarian society. So they decided, we're going to jumpstart capitalism in our state. And it was dominated by a single industry, which was rail. And it included proto-democratic reforms, including these sort of participatory zemstvos that were small, sort of like town halls based on the commune system. They also spread political reforms and educational infrastructure during that time. And the way that you can see these things play out throughout the history of Russia is that once they had become dominated by this single industry, a general strike started. And it really wasn't a general strike until the railroad got involved. Because the railroad was so central to their entire economy, once the railroad workers quit, nobody else could work. So they just joined the strike anyway. The educational infrastructure that they wound up creating in this period actually allowed them to import and disseminate all sorts of oppositional ideologies. And the government really tried to play this balance of repression versus allowance. They wanted to sort of allow the not so harmful ideologies, but sort of restrict anything that smelled of socialism. But they really couldn't do that because they were always a step behind. And then the last part is that the democratic reforms that they did around the commune system actually wound up legitimizing all of their opposition. Once they gave them this power to have this political forum, they ran with it. And because they were based on this commune system, it was all hyper local. And really all socialists needed to do in the end was coordinate all of these things toward a common goal, which was the socialist revolution. But we live in the Western Hemisphere, so our socialism tends to come from colonial states. They come about because colonial capitalism is the assimilation of a territory into a larger colonial empire as a source state for labor and raw materials, or as a forced purchaser of goods and loans to the detriment of the colonized people. And you can see this in sort of practical terms nowadays with the situation in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a territory, but it's not technically sovereign, and it's not really a foreign territory. And a lot of the reason for that is so that we can force loans on them and to force their debt higher and higher year over year and constrict their trade and not allow them to trade with other countries as freely as they can with America. But then we also penalize that trade heavily through fines and tariffs and taxes. So in the end, we fuel their debt by making everything more expensive, and then we also make money on the debt. For colonies, capitalism is their state. The governments are completely designed to enforce the capital interests of the colonizers. That usually includes a racial hierarchy. It excludes larger indigenous populations. There's usually a selective representation in the government. If there are indigenous people, usually they are picked either on the basis of looking white or being willing to go along with capital interests, such as giving people exclusive mining rights. They may include slavery. They often do. This includes today, even with Nestle. They were just in the news for their child slavery case, and the Supreme Court, our highest law of the land, decided that they were completely in the right to use child slavery, apparently. And they exploit labor and trade. So either a form of slavery or incredibly low wages and dictating their imports and exports, like I explained with Puerto Rico. So the collective response to colonial capitalism. Since the chief purpose of colonial capitalism is the exploitation of labor and exports, the natural counters are worker organization and the nationalization and redistribution of natural resources, such as land, mines, and agricultural products. This also sometimes includes major industries, such as banking, so that the state is less dependent on foreign loans and foreign capital. Since slavery is a component of colonial capitalism, abolition is often a driving force in their uprisings. Now comes the American Revolution. Here's a question for you, just to ponder. You don't actually have to answer it. But has America ever had a socialist uprising? America is a capitalist nation which relies on colonial capitalism. So has it ever had a socialist revolution? Oh, there we go. The American imperial state has, and it's crushed many of them, from the Caribbean to South America, as well as the Pacific. But depending on your perspective, it has basically been in a constant state of revolution because it is a colonial state that became a colonial empire and has had to quell rebellions of their indigenous populations in order to control that colonial empire. A lot of the reason that our government is structured in such a repressive way is that guy, James Madison. His major concern when it came to society was that the government must protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Meaning, in his view, the constitutional system would have to prevent democracy. From that, you get a state that expressly opposes the creation of a welfare state or pursuit of the common interest. And you see that all the way until today. That's where a lot of this rugged individualism comes from, is because we set up a nation that was never supposed to care for people. And that was sort of the common accepted thing, because the way that you would get cared for is with stolen land and stolen resources. You would be given room to expand into all of these territories which you didn't really control, but you would eventually. It also requires capital to participate in its functions, including like land holding requirements. At certain points, there was the requirement to have a job, all sorts of things that require you to have money and connections in order to continue to do so. And then it also ceded a co-equal branch of government directly to capital interests. And that's through the appointment of your federal senators by your state itself. The entire point of this, when they were drafting the Constitution, was that the Senate must be the deliberative body and therefore must be beholden to the interests of the state, which meant the large landholders of the state. So all of the landholders would be in the government, voted in by landholders, and then they would pick their favorite landholder in order to represent all of them in negotiations. It also codified and enforced racial hierarchy through police powers, which we still see today. Oppression, both foreign and domestic. I have a great example of our current colonial empire. It is someone speaking to Elon Musk. You know what wasn't in the best interest of people? The US government organizing a coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia so you could attain the lithium there. Elon Musk, we will coup whoever we want. Deal with it. And unfortunately, he was right. This is a map of CIA and military interventions, as well as bombings across the country just since World War II. If you'll notice, a lot of those red portions tend to be very, very poor countries that have switched a lot of hands over the years. That's intentional. You'll also see that a lot of the assassinations that the CIA undertook are along the coast, because we have one of the most powerful navies in the world. We want control of trade routes. We want to be able to control other people's trade. So as long as we have some sort of ally, or the government is sympathetic to us, or their people are just terrified of us, then we get what we want in trade. And we can dominate these trade routes as far as we can. Just like we held Panama and the Panama Canal by forcing a civil war in an otherwise stable country in order to give a whole tract of land to people that would then give us back that land so that we could build the Panama Canal which we then owned for, I think it was like 100 years, is what the lease was. And Panama eventually was like, no, we're done with this. But that wasn't until the 2000s that they finally got rid of the Panama Canal being owned by America. Enforcement of this empire has been the leading global driver of oppression and instability. And it's actually true. Everything from Yemen to Libya to Egypt to Iran in the 70s, all throughout Central and South America. What we have done is we have constantly taken the board and just shaken it up whenever we don't like what's on it. And we'll sit there and we'll give money and weapons and material and resources to very repressive regimes who then take over their country to give us favorable deals. And then once they're in power, they turn around and start to dislike us. And the moment that they start to dislike us or they stop giving us favorable deals, we just shake the board up again. But this also is like a two-pronged thing because we are a colonial state that became a colonial empire. We still have colonial rules within our own borders. So you can essentially think of America as ground zero for the sort of harm and destruction we spread around. And the more that we're able to enforce our own internal colonial barriers, the more we're able to spread those out. And the more that we spread those out and they start to recoil against us, the harsher we clamp down on our internal politics. So that way the people in power still stay in power, even if they lose all of the things that are giving them power, like access to mining, or access to oil, or access to trade routes. In our domestic policies, you see this in things like monopoly, and actually sending the military and the police to bust unions. Our Supreme Court took a hammer to the first attempts that we had at trust busting and monopoly enforcement. And a Maine judge was actually one of the chief people responsible for that. Chief Justice Melville Fuller wrote the decision gutting the Sherman antitrust rules way back in the 1890s, beginning of the 1900s. Some of our other domestic policies are the exploitation of Black and migrant workers. Obviously, we had slavery, but it didn't just stop at slavery. What we did was we created the 13th Amendment, and it gave this giant loophole to the South, which is if you are arrested for a crime, you can still be enslaved. So what happened was the moment that slavery ended, there now became a slavery industry in America where these sheriffs were essentially just going out, rounding people up, charging them with petty crimes, and then selling them off to mines. So the investment and the ownership of slaves is simply what changed. The overall system of slavery didn't much. And then once Black folks started to get more and more rights, they started using other labor for that. One of the reasons that we have such harsh immigration policies and why it's so hard to be able to become a citizen in this country and why it is so lenient on employers when they do crack down on immigration, despite the fact that they'll go and raid a business and take 250 workers, but the boss is still there, is because this is how we have replaced slave labor. We've replaced slave labor by creating people who, while they are technically free, have none of the rights of a citizen, even though they should have some protection because they're on American soil. We've taken all of that from them just by saying, all right, you're technically not a person here. You don't have the same labor rights. You can't sue in a court. You can't have any protections. And if you do try to win yourself some sort of improvement in conditions, your boss can just report you to the police and have you taken away and replace you with a new worker who's in even worse situations. This is also enforced by a crazy domestic surveillance apparatus. It was really bad around the end of Eisenhower, and it just gradually got worse and worse. By the time the 60s came around, you had folks like Martin Luther King being surveilled by the FBI. You had people like Fred Hampton being set up and assassinated between in a coordinated campaign between the FBI and local police using informants and spies. And this is all intentional. It's to monitor, disrupt, and assassinate opposition. If we can't disrupt you, then we'll just kill you. And you can see this like play out in multiple ways, even if it isn't done by the federal government. Other parts of the government step up and do it themselves. You had the Philadelphia Move bombing, which was essentially, we can't get rid of these organizers here in this neighborhood, so we'll just firebomb them and take out the entire neighborhood because the neighborhood's helping them. So if we just kill enough of them, then everybody in the neighborhood gets the message. But we've also killed all the leaders, so even if they didn't get the message, they can't reorganize themselves, or at least not very easily. And then the last domestic policy that we have is purges from government and elite society. We saw this in the Reconstruction era, right after the Civil War in Wilmington, North Carolina. A bunch of KKK members decided that they didn't like the fact that most of this town was run by Black folk because there was a lot of Black folk in this town. They should be representing themselves, but they didn't want them to have that agency. So they just purged them from government. Anyone who wouldn't leave or resign on their own was simply murdered, and anyone who helped them was also murdered. We also had purges in the form of, from the federal government in the form of McCarthyism during the Cold War. This also translated into things like the AFL-CIO purging communists. All of this was meant to just weaken the left in the entire country so that capital interests could be entrenched and protected. And you see a lot of that reflected in how foreign policy operates. They want exclusive mining and resource rights. So they want to clamp down on labor. They want to destabilize governments. And that destabilization of governments actually helps create migrant populations that they then turn around and exploit when they try to come here looking for an escape from the conditions that we created ourselves. And if your government is constantly destabilized, it doesn't matter if, say, your president decides that your country isn't going to trade with America. You can just pay a warlord to create a black market and you'll still get your goods into that country and you'll still get goods out of that country. And then you get the added bonus of stealing revenue from that country. So in some ways, creating a black market system to get around a government is more beneficial to capitalists because it makes them more money. It also makes their opponents weaker. Then you also have the CIA, which is sort of the foreign policy version of the FBI, and it acts exactly the same way. It surveils, it undermines, and it assassinates oppositional leaders. We've seen this all throughout Central and South America, but it happened in Iran. If you ever get a chance to pick it up, you can get it at Bull Moose if they're not being jerks to their employees right now. It's called Persephone. It's a graphic novel. It's about a girl who grew up in Iran right as the revolution happened and the Shah was overthrown. Iran had nationalized their oil. Everyone didn't like it. So the US and Britain got together and overthrew their government so that way they could get the oil back. That government is the government that now runs Iran that hates us. Rightfully so. They understand what we will do to a foreign government that doesn't do what they say. with firsthand experience. They all got into power that way. And we also conduct purges and coups of other countries. We tend to call it regime change. We did it in Libya with Gaddafi. We did it in Iraq with Saddam. We did it in Afghanistan. And we'll probably continue to do it until somebody reins in our imperialism. Some of those strategies and methods that we use in order to weaken other states, in order to extract resources from them, are things like economic warfare. The Cuban embargo is a good example. Cuba decided to align itself with the Soviet Union, and so we tried to destroy them economically. We tried to cut them off from all trade in the international market as best we could. We've done a fairly good job of it. And right now, with the COVID pandemic, it's helping us achieve that goal even more, which is horrifying, obviously. We as socialists don't want that. We don't want to see that country, any country, destroyed in that way, especially when it comes to basic things like food and medicine, and much less basic things like international loans and being able to send your products out to the international market without basically being allowed to be ripped off. We also see this with sanctions. We have sanctioned Yemen, even though they're currently being bombed by Saudi Arabia constantly. And Saudi Arabia, in turn, has created a blockade, for lack of a better term, of Yemen, which is fueling starvation. So they can't get money and they can't get resources. And Saudi Arabia is essentially just trying to weaken them to the point that they can just assimilate them later. Debt peonage, like I explained with Puerto Rico, but this also works in America. That's what student loans are. Your student loan is a way of creating perpetual debt that you can never escape. In the same way that we try to create perpetual debt to Puerto Rico, we do that to our own people, because we know that if you are constantly in debt, then you have less ability to fight back against the system in which you are in. You have less authority and you have less control over your life. We also do the same thing with austerity. There's a reason that we don't fund our social services as well as we should. We don't want to. We don't want people to be mentally healthy, because if we are mentally healthy, then we can understand what's going on to us. If we don't have the things that we need, we're constantly in fear of losing even the smallest amount of things. They also use subversion, which is the weaponization of public sentiment, propaganda, agitating oppositional leadership in foreign countries, and internal propaganda, such as yellow journalism, which got us into the Spanish-American War. We will constantly try to send the CIA into foreign countries, not just to assassinate people or like overthrow a government, but to create the conditions in which we can do that. Unnecessary sorts of internal strife that makes it harder to respond to a crisis for another country. But we also do this to ourselves. Look at what has happened with COVID. Massive disinformation. And most of it stems from one person in power wanting to entrench their power and seeing COVID and the denial of a problem as politically beneficial in the long run. And it kind of was until people started really dying. And then the last strategy and method I'll talk about is guerrilla warfare, which is just straight up paying warlords to go and fight wars for you. We do this in Afghanistan. The people that we hand money are often terrible people, that they're paid to be terrible people. There have been people who have had like child slaves with them while we're dropping off this money. And we're just like, yeah, this is cool because you'll do the thing that we want to, and you'll give us the things that we say that we want. And in exchange, we just hand you this pallet of money that isn't even really ours. So in America, we actually have had sort of periods of progress internally, but then you get to see just how far we'll go with our own repression internally. So you had abolition, and the reactionary response to that was the Civil War. You had Reconstruction, and the response was Jim Crow. You had civil rights, and the response was mass incarceration all the way up until Bill Clinton and even Obama. And then you had full participation in politics in the BLM uprising, which led to Trump and the current reactionary crackdown. And what I mean by full participation in politics is the last few cycles, especially Obama's first presidential win, you saw historic numbers of people of color, but especially Black people, get involved in politics in ways that people didn't expect. And almost immediately, the very next election cycle, you started seeing them ratchet up things like uh, voter ID and doing voter roll purges and not, and basically like doing whatever they can, including gerrymandering, to just ensure that their power doesn't go away, even if the people that they have seen come out and participate again. They have figured out that if they just crack down on the Democratic wing of America, that they'll just get what they want in the end. And there's not really anybody who's going to stop them, because the opposition party are also capitalists and they also benefit from this. They benefit from all of this, which is why Joe Biden will sit there and say that Cuba is a terrible country and it deserves to continue an embargo. He's also it's also the reason that a governor like Janet Mills won't stop pretextual traffic stops. It's because it all serves the same exact purpose, and that's capitalism. And they're all capitalists, so they want capitalism to succeed, and they see it as functioning the way that it should. They want themselves to be good arbiters and good custodians of capitalism rather than good people doing what is necessary for the people. They prefer the system over the individuals. And this is just a bit of a like a timeline of various periods that correlate to that last timeline. And I'm going to stop right there because that is my last slide and take some questions.
If anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat. And I have one just to start off. You, first of all, thank you for this. This like really clarified a lot of things for me. One question I had was, it's more of just like, if you have an example of, I really liked how you explained the, how we like export our domestic policies internationally to kind of like replicate capitalism in America, our version of it. And I was wondering if you know any examples of how we've like exported mass incarceration. Because I know America's, like we're number one on people in prison. I don't know if like other countries, like we've tried to replicate that in other places. Anyway, I don't know. Maybe there's a question in there.
Mass incarceration is sort of uniquely American. I would say that the best that we have come to that is actually how Mexico has handled drugs. We used our influence to sort of influence a lot of other countries' drug policies. That includes how we have dealt with Afghanistan poppy farmers. It took us more than 10 years to figure out that you can't just burn an entire poppy field because people actually rely on that income. And we finally stopped doing it. And then Trump got into office and he immediately turned around and started burning it again because he's more worried about repression and like holding the line of capitalism than what is actually effective in that country. But when it comes to Mexico, Mexico and Central America don't actually need to be as tough on drugs as they are. Um, and the reason I say that is because they're the suppliers. If they wanted to, they could just legalize their industry in their country. The reason that they don't is because of us. We tell them that we won't give them access to markets. We tell them that we won't give them access to aid and money and trade opportunities and our companies if they don't hold the line when it comes to drugs. And so in a state like Mexico, where you have a very large like transportation industry between Central America and America itself, that has created this crazy sort of power imbalance between the cartels and the government. And we fund them with guns and money for our drugs. And in turn, they get to be as powerful as they want to within that country. They don't, some of the cartels barely care about like judges. Like they'll assassinate a judge that goes against them. And the reason that like they can't have mass incarceration is for that reason. You have to have a strong central state that can crack down on these things the way that we have in order to have mass incarceration. But because America is fueling this industry with both money and resources, you don't have that same dynamic. You have to have a really well controlled state to have mass incarceration.
Gotcha. Thank you. Andrew has one in the chat. Why is capitalism a driving force for oppression rather than just white supremacy?
Because white supremacy is sort of a tool of capitalism. Even if they couldn't get away with being blatantly white supremacist, they would still be exploitative. It comes down to money in the end, because in a capitalist system, money is power. Money is what everything has been built around, and monetization of things is the most important factor. So if you can easily take Coca-Cola, for instance. Coca-Cola doesn't want to be homophobic publicly. They might go and like funnel money somewhere to some third world country because they think that it'll help them. I don't know that specifically about Coca-Cola. Don't sue me. But the point is that like they understand how other markets work. They understand that just because America is hyper fixated on these things doesn't mean that every country will be. And if you're, say, blatantly xenophobic against Muslims as a company, that means that you can't have access to the Muslim market, which is massive. There's billions of people in it, as well as like you can't be blatantly racist towards Indians because there's 1.3 billion Indians. You can't really be xenophobic against China. And that's why you see like the NBA being like, yeah, we like the Communist Party and we're cool with China, because they have a massive market. It vastly outpaces our own just from sheer population size. So even if we are in control of global resources, like our global culture isn't dominant anymore. So white supremacy isn't the breadwinner.
I think just to follow up about what about the existence of oppression in countries like the USSR or Cuba?
Twofold. One is that there is a reactionary element within all cultures. And part of that is fueled by how they relate to America. So, for instance, Cuba and the USSR are, in the case of the USSR, were very oppositional to America. And the way that America responded was how we respond with every other country, which is espionage and subversion and trying to stir up like proxy wars. And so the way that you counter that, unfortunately, is to also do lots of espionage and counterintelligence. And that's why the Cold War went the way that it did. is because nobody wanted to be overt about things and start open war, but they wanted to do all of the things involved in war, which is taking over satellite states, controlling trade routes, bringing people into their fold and taking over like resources and allies and coalitions. Like that was always the goal. So you're going to have to, in some respects, fight fire with fire. No one wants to do it, but in a country where you might get assassinated because America doesn't like you, you have a tendency to want to do that. And then on the other hand, you just have certain characters who get into power and then their worst instincts kick in. I don't know the like ins and outs of all foreign policy, but what I can say is that some people just take power wrong. It doesn't mean that everything that they do is going to be bad, and it doesn't mean that everything that they do is going to be good. There are nuances within these things. And there is also the fact that we live in a heavily propagandized state. It is very hard for us as Americans to like parse that nuance because we're so disconnected from reality to begin with, because we tell ourselves that toppling a foreign government is good for the people of that government. We tell ourselves that people are bad because they're opposed to our interests rather than being actually bad on principle. And so you have to parse out a lot of that. But at the end of the day, terrible people are still going to be terrible if they get into power. And power does corrupt people. So in some instances, a person might have gone in with very pure intentions. And because of all of the animosity between them and, say, America, and all of the paranoia and the hostility, they become corrupted and they start to deploy methods that they shouldn't have. And they start to act in ways that they shouldn't have, such as repeating things that America has done, such as purges, such as repression of like media and journalists. But that doesn't make their system bad. And I understand that probably sounds hypocritical because I'm saying that capitalism is inherently bad for these reasons, but capitalism is honestly slightly better than monarchy, but not as good as socialism in its respect for the entire population. Because everything in a capitalist society is so individualized. It really doesn't matter if the person next to you is okay. It only matters if you're okay. That's the only thing that should matter in your world. Whereas any sort of collective society is going to have some inherent need to take care of the next person. And I hope that wasn't too long-winded of an answer for you.
I don't have any more questions myself, but does anyone else have anything they want to ask? Any comments? Cool. Well, Israel, thank you so much for hosting this. I mean, I got a lot out of it, and I hope other people did too. I think a couple of people mentioned they did. This, if you want to share this, it'll be on our YouTube channel soon, and you'll get a copy to your email. But Israel, thank you so much for hosting this.
Not a problem. It was great to be here, and I'm glad that everybody got something out of it.
Yeah, it was awesome. Thanks, everyone, and I hope to see you around.